Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Budget ABCs. My name is Kate Sugg, and I'm a program administrator with the Westchester County Youth Bureau. A reminder to please mute your microphones. This session will be recorded. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to enter them into the chat, or you can unmute at the end of the session during the Q&A period. I would now like to introduce our presenter so we can get started. Allison Paul with Allison Paul Grant Writing and Consulting. Take it away, Allison.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. This is a budget workshop, and I've divided it into two parts. I want it to be as practical as possible for you. I know a lot of you are already involved in grant writing. I know a lot of people are intimidated by budgets, and my first dictum of the day is they're just numbers. Don't worry. It's not that scary. The first part, I'm going to give you some tips and pointers, and the second half, I'm going to put up a lot of examples of budgets with mistakes. I've reached out to a couple of program officers. I've asked them what are some common mistakes that you've seen, and I've created some budgets with mistakes, and we're going to go through them and see if you can spot the boo-boos. So that's the program for today. Hands-on, not just me talking. You have to do some thinking this morning. Yikes, I hope you had your coffee. Just a little bit about me. This is, I've done a number of these workshops for the Youth Bureau. It's always my pleasure to do that. I'm co-president of something called Grant Professionals of Lower Hudson, and we are a group of grant writers, people that work for organizations, be they grant writers, executive directors, development associates, anybody involved in grant writing, as well as consultants. And I've had my own freelance consulting business for a number of years. Before that, I was a full-time grant writer for a school district. I came up through the arts world, learned how to write my first grant at the Hudson River Museum, worked in the arts for a number of years. And then just a couple of community highlights. I founded and directed the Tarrytown Arts Camp for 16 years, and I co-founded an organization called Music Works, and we continued to do one-on-one music lessons for lower income students in the Tarrytowns. So that's short and sweet. That's who I am. All right, today's topic, budget ABCs. And I added a D because I want us to smile a little this morning, have a little fun. So first, most important, you should make sure the budget corresponds to the narrative. What does that mean? You might think, well, that's obvious. Sometimes it doesn't happen that way. The people writing the budget are sometimes different than the people writing the narrative, and it can go askew. You're writing about the need for computers, and there's nothing about computers in the budget, or vice versa. So make sure you correspond to the narrative, and if you change one, let's say you decide the budget is too big, you have to take something out, make sure you change the narrative accordingly. 2, be realistic, be clear. Funders are going to see right through you if you say we need a $5,000 computer or something. They're going to see right through anything that's unrealistic. Check your math. I'm probably going to say this about 10 times today. And I highly recommend using Excel, that you should do all the math calculations in an Excel spreadsheet. And here's D for some fun. ABCs, we're adding a D. Don't forget to redo your math if you make changes on a budget line. I hope you know what that means. So if you're working on your budget and you take something out or you move something and make changes, don't forget to redo the math. You've decided to have 5 tutors instead of 6. Make sure you redo the math. When I've talked to a lot of people about budgets, especially people that are new to grant writing, if you didn't come up on the program side, you might not have an idea of what is a program or a project budget. You might not really understand what that is. I think everybody on this call has possibly gotten a Youth Bureau grant, so you've had to write a program budget. But it's different than an organization budget. You need to think, what does it really take to make a program happen? What resources do you need? And I encourage you to start thinking about that, the resources you need and anything else, the personnel, when you start to plan your grant. So start thinking about the budget as soon as you start planning your grant. Sometimes I think people wait to do the budget to the end. I think that's a mistake. And unless you're a solo shop, you're going to need to talk to other people. So involve them early. If you need to bring in a finance person, if you need to bring in a program director or 2 program directors, bring them in early to get their thoughts, ideas, find out what resources they need to be part of this program. For the most part, you should not ask the funder for the whole budget. There are exceptions, but most funders like to see you have some skin in the game or other organizations are supporting it. So let's say your project budget is $50,000 for your summer camp. You're probably not going to get one grant of $50,000. You're probably going to need multiple grants depending on the funder and the range they award. You might need a few grants between $5,000, $10,000, and $15,000 to get your $50,000 grant. Hopefully all of you know you don't just write one grant and you're going to get your full $50,000 and you're on your way. That would be nice, but it doesn't happen too often. Funders really like to see that others are supporting you. So they're probably not going to give you the whole budget, and they want to see other people are also backing you. This slide I started, what is a program or project budget? If you don't have any experience with programming, if you're new to your job or that's not the place you are in your agency, if you don't understand programs, take the time to get out of your office and watch a program. Go over and see what's happening in your organization. Get a feel for what is really going on. Watch, observe, learn. The first time I wrote an Even Start grant, which is a federal grant that's no longer offered, I actually went to a 4-day early family literacy training program to get a real feel for what the program was, what the different components were, and what the resources that would be needed to bring this new program to our district. So, learn. Just quickly, what is in a grant budget? The first thing I want to say is a grant budget includes revenues as well as expenses. And I've been a grant reviewer. I've seen a couple of times where people only send in the expenses. I want to know, where's your money coming from? Every funder wants to know, where are you getting your revenues? Who else is supporting you? How much are you putting into the program? So the basic is you have revenue, you have expenses, and you have the net and what you're asking for, your project request. Sometimes when you do a budget, you're asked if you have other grants pending. You might just be asked to say how much you have pending, or you might be asked to spell out what other funders have already committed or are out there that you're waiting to hear back from. Why? Again, your funder wants to know they're not the only ones supporting you. All right, let's break it down a little more. This page is just revenue. Different sources of revenue might be earned income, like tickets, memberships, admission, class fees, So if you're a museum or a zoo or a place where people go, you might have those kinds of admissions or memberships. Some of you might have class fees, maybe if you're a Y or something, you offer classes. So those are forms of revenue called earned income. And then contributed. Everybody in a nonprofit world is very eager to grow their contributed income. That means corporate support, foundation support, individual giving, annual appeals, individual donations. Sometimes special events is included under individual support. Sometimes special events, your galas, your walkathons, is on a separate line. And then there's also some government grants. Hopefully some of you are getting government grants. So that's the contributed income. Some grant funders want you to write your in-kind contributions. That might mean space that's donated, buses, supplies, volunteers. So sometimes you're asked to come up with a rough number of your in-kind contributions. Sometimes you're not. Expenses. What are typical expenses? Almost always it's personnel. Usually in a budget, you're going to fill in your personnel and then everything that's not personnel. Personnel are people that get W-2s, your permanent employees, your full and part-time people, not your hourly or your temporaries. People that get fringe benefits, that's your personnel. Sometimes I've seen organizations add payroll processing fees under personnel, sometimes. So if you use an outside agency to process your payroll, that's sometimes allowed under personnel. Let's look at an example. Let's say you're writing a budget and you have a program manager. You're going to write, you have one program manager, and you're going to take that person's salary, which is $79,656. You're going to allocate a portion, an estimate, you're estimating, no one's going to hold you to it, of the time they're going to spend on this particular project. So here the example, we're estimating they're going to spend 15% of their time, and we do the math. 15% of the 79,656 equals 11,948, and you're going to check that. And I advise doing a lot of this in an Excel spreadsheet. You can do it on a calculator, but check, check, and recheck. Keeping going, for our project, for our whatever I said it was going to be a summer camp, we have one program manager and one program assistant. The assistant is paid at $45,000 a year, and we're only going to take 5% of their time for our project. We do the math. We get a subtotal of personnel. So the 11,948 plus the 2,250 is 14,198. Our agency has fringe benefits at 23%. Going to multiply that. We get the 3,266, and we add it all together, and we get the total amount. All right. And there's my little Excel spreadsheet example. So I do all this math in Excel. And I still check it to make sure I didn't do anything wrong or didn't put the wrong number in or plug in the wrong thing. All right. And Kate, if you see any questions, just interrupt and let me know.
Will do, Allison. Thanks. No questions right now.
Okay, good. So that was personnel, a very, very short, simple personnel. Anything that's not personnel on your budget spreadsheet is either going to be called non-personnel or other than personnel, sometimes abbreviated to OTP. Some organizations will give you a list of possibilities of what you are allowed to put in under other expenses, and sometimes you just write in your own on your budget sheet. Common things: a consultant, contracted services, for instance, hourly people. So if you're running a summer program and you're going to hire 10 college kids, they would be contracted either hourly or whatever the rate is you pay them. And then typical other things for your programs: you might have to pay transportation. Probably everybody has supplies. Maybe you provide training for staff. Maybe you need to rent space. You got to market the program. You'll have some marketing costs. You might have some fundraising expenses for your program, et cetera, et cetera. All kinds of possibilities. You don't need them all, only the categories that pertain. And again, we're talking about a project or program budget. So an example, we're doing a workshop. You funder wants to see how you got to your number. So again, it's a little bit of a guesstimate, but you're going to have 10 participants and you're going to think it's about $5 a person for the 10 workshops. I'm going to put $500 down. We have 2 tutors for our program. We're going to pay them $20 each, 10 hours a week for 20 weeks. There you go. Then some budgets allow you to do indirect costs and some don't. We're going to talk more about indirect costs later. So this is the very, very, very basic, simple expenses. All right, we've looked at basic revenues, basic expenses. The budget is important. Don't dismiss the budget. Here's the key thing. I have seen that some organizations have one person writing the grant and someone else doing the budget. Someone has got to be ultimately responsible for checking to make sure the narrative and the lines in the budget are the same, that they mesh. They're talking about the same program. The content and the math are the same. They should tell the same story. You don't want to read a narrative about A, B, and C with no mention of red hats, and in the budget, you're ordering 100 red hats. You know, explain why we need red hats, because when we go on field trips, we want every kid to have a hat we can identify readily. You have to make sure you're explaining. Don't make your reviewer raise eyebrows or scratch their heads in puzzlement. If your budget is messy, well, if I walked into your office and I saw a big mess, what might my first impression be? Maybe not a good one. If you submit a messy budget, that just gives the reviewer the sense that maybe the whole organization is kind of sloppy. That is not the impression you want to convey. Be mindful that if it's a bigger grant, some people are going to review the content, other people are going to pick apart the finances. For instance, if you've ever done an Impact 100 grant, they have a whole finance committee that looks closely at the budget and does a deep dive. So don't think you can hide anything in your budget. They might be closely scrutinized by people that really get it. All right, what's going on? Why can't I advance my screen here? There we go. Be realistic, proofread, proofread, proofread. Especially if it's a complicated form that you're asked to fill in, not your own budget form, a form that has maybe multiple columns, just make sure that everything adds up horizontally and vertically. I'm going to say that again, horizontally and vertically. And in the next section, when I show some budget mistakes, I'm going to talk more about what that means. Sometimes you're asked to provide budgets for more than 1 year, and sometimes line items will change over time. So maybe you need to invest in something the first year, but you don't need it the second or third years. Or maybe the third year you're working up to something you're going to need to spend money on. You just make sure to explain what you're doing and why. So just be aware, From the funder's perspective, they want to invest in an organization that they think is going to stay afloat, that seems to be able to handle and monitor their expenses. They want to see your overall financial health and how their grant fits into the bigger picture. They want to know, are you a stable professional organization worthy of their money? I've seen a lot more of that and a lot more deep diving questions since COVID. It seems to me funders want to know, are you still going to be around after COVID? It was certainly a challenging time, is still. All right. I know some people get very nervous about budgets, so stay calm. You're sometimes asked for budget notes or a narrative. It's not the time to take out your inner Proust. It's short, sweet, and to the point. You might include the math. You might say, if you don't have room in your budget worksheet, you might say, here, we're going to have, we need staff to implement the program. We're going to have 2 workshop leaders at $50 an hour, and so on. It's explaining. You're just communicating. Make sure your budget makes sense to someone outside your program group or maybe outside your organization. We always say, show your grant to someone else if you have time. If you're new to budget writing, make sure you show your first budget or 2 to someone else to make sure you're not making assumptions, that someone else can understand what you're doing. Whenever I write a budget narrative, I always try to say exactly this: costs are reasonable and realistic to achieve our goals. I've even said at times we run a lean, budget. We're very conscientious, just convey responsibility, professionalism. If they do or if they don't ask for budget notes or narrative, if there's some extenuating circumstances or some peculiarities, make sure you do explain them. So one organization I work with does a fundraiser every other year. That means one year they have a lot of fundraising income, the next year they don't. They use the fundraising income and expect it to last for 2 years, but that makes some of their budgets look wonky, and sort of every other year they have a small deficit. So I always include a note explaining that. So whatever that peculiarity is, make sure you are writing a note to it. I have attached notes to, sometimes they ask you to upload a budget and in a PDF form. I have attached notes that explain some idiosyncratic thing and put it right in the PDF with a kind of big note. If any of you did the Business First grants to the county, I did the workshops for Nonprofit Westchester, and that's what I advise people to do. So you can add a note to a PDF of your budget. The point is, don't make them raise their eyebrows or be concerned. Get ahead of the questions and explain anything that might look alarming or peculiar ahead of time. That shows you really see the big picture and you're explaining things. That makes you look more professional. I've been talking mostly about program budgets that accompany our requests, just to make sure you understand. Almost every grant you submit, you're asked to submit your organization's operating budget, your general operating budget. Sometimes we get to submit GOS or general operating support grants, and that's great, but too many funders want a program budget. They won't give you unrestricted general operating support. So just make sure you're aware of what you're submitting. You're going to be asked to submit your general operating support budget and your program budget that's obviously going to be smaller, right? Because it's a piece of the whole organization. And then scale. Reviewers, your grant reviewers are going to look for scale. Is your request in line with the whole organization budget? So if you're asking for a project and you're asking for 80% of the whole organization budget, your reviewers are going to think you're out of the league, you're scrambling. That's out of scale. And then another really important point I want to emphasize. This is on the other end. You've gotten the grant. You have a program officer. Something happens with the project and you need to change things. If the budget changes significantly, if you need to move things around, if you've lost a staff person, if the program had to be suspended because it was shut down because of COVID, if something happens, contact the program officer. Do not move money around unless it's just a few dollars without talking to the program officer. You want them on your side. You want to get another budget the next year, and you need to be in touch with them. Think of them as your friend, your colleague. They're investing in you, and make them part of what's going on. Overhead costs. So I know we have a couple of EDs on this call. It costs a lot of money to run an organization. It's more than just the program. There's the space, the utilities, paying for the website, paying for the audit, the accountant, the phones. For a long time, funders really kind of ignored that. But I'm seeing on webinars that I've been on with funders over the past year or two, that funders are increasingly willing to recognize that there are real costs involved with running a nonprofit. And even if you are writing for an organization that's largely volunteer, please acknowledge there are real costs. And you harm our whole sector if you say you are an all-volunteer organization with no overhead. I have heard program officers say in some of these webinars, including GPLH, Grant Professionals, did a Meet the Funders event last fall where we had different program officers. And they said the reviewers want to hear about your overhead. They want to see your real costs align in your budget for indirect costs. And then they show that to their bosses to say, you know, these nonprofits have real costs beyond the projects. We should make sure we allow indirect costs. And it also helps them make the case for more general operating budgets, which gives you unrestricted money as opposed to always having to do a narrower project budget. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions about that? So please try to include, yes, there are often caps. Oh, look, I do see that comment. Yay. Some funders have caps on indirect costs. Some funders allow it and some don't. And there are caps, and government has formulas for what you can do. I'm not going to go into that right now. But I do want to make the case for showing the real cost beyond just paying for 5 tutors and 2 laptops. The real cost to do that is our overhead. Most funders, if they allow it, allow a ratio of between 10 and 15%. Almost all will tell you what it is. And I saw there was a question, but I didn't see it in time.
Allison, Lori asked, do funders ever allow program budgets to consider any overhead?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why you have to look and see what they do allow. We're going to look at some in the next half. But you have to see, they will tell you if they do or do not. And sometimes they will say what their cap is if they do allow it. So you have to read the instructions. Some organizations or some funders also ask you for in-kind services, and you could take a few minutes and try to calculate that as well. And if you do have a lot of volunteers and you want to calculate your volunteer labor hours to show that you have a lot of in-kind support, this I did this, I guess, last year. The independent sector calculates the rate of a volunteer hour in New York at $33. So here's the website. You'll get the slides afterwards, and you can always every year look and update it. And that is for those of you that want to say we have steady volunteers in our program, and this is the value of it. Because it just shows, again, that it's more than just the little bit of a program budget that is involved in making your programs and your organization happen. We in the nonprofit sector know what all goes into it, but sometimes our funders don't. So putting it all together, a very simple budget. Remember, I said you have income and expenses and how much you're asking them for. So simple, simple, simple. We have income. In this case, we have student fees. We have individual donations. We say we have 2 grants pending already from a foundation. So we're pretty sure of getting this amount of money. Here's what our expenses are: an instructor, supplies, the coordinator, field trip admission. We have a total. We have a deficit. So if we took 6,450 minus 7,450, we have a $1,000 deficit, and that's what we're asking this funder for. That's about as short, compact, and simple as it gets. Don't worry, I have lots of examples of budgets. Here's one that's a little more substantive. We received a grant from the All Right Foundation. We have a couple of grants pending. We have individual contributions. How do you get this number? You are going to talk to whoever you need to within your organization, and you're going to allocate a portion of the individual contributions that your organization gets as a whole, and you're going to allocate X amount of dollars to this program. Similarly, you're going to allocate a certain amount from your year-round fundraising to this program and come up with the total income number. Your expenses are, in this case, we have 3 staff people. We're going to take 10% of each person's time. We put the math over here. We get a subtotal for salaries. We're going to multiply that subtotal towards our fringe benefit rate of 25%. Then we get a total personnel. Other than personnel, we show, in this case, we have room to show what our supplies are. And we have a bunch of supplies, so we're writing them all in. And if you didn't have time to write it in the form, this could be in your budget narrative. Here I even wrote out what kind of computers we're going to get, not just computers, but I priced out Chromebooks at one point. We're going to do staff training, and we get an other than personnel. I would have this all done, calculated in my Excel spreadsheet. I'd have this line, the subtotal, be a formula, so I wouldn't make a math mistake. Then I would take, in this case, my administrative overhead of 10%. I think you can see that 10% of 39,873 looks right. I get a total expense. I subtract my total income, and I get my net request. This is the amount I'm asking them. This is a format that I like to use. I think it's clear. I'm going to show you how to break this down in a couple of minutes.
Allison, we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
How does the funder know what their net request will be used for?
That's what your whole grant narrative is about. We are asking for money to do X, Y, and Z. That's in your narrative, and it's going to match what you're asking for. All right, we're going to look at some this is the interactive part. All right, what's wrong? So here is a budget that you might be given. This is in Excel. You might sometimes are asked to break it down. So here is the position. Here is their full-time salary. You would enter this. You enter the positions and the salaries, the percent of time devoted to this project. And in this case, you're submitting for a 2-year grant. All right. So I'm going to give you guys a minute to look at this and start taking notes. This is a budget with some mistakes. What do you see went wrong?
Allison, while everyone is examining this budget, we have another question, and I'm wondering if you can offer some insight. If you have multiple employees working on a grant budget, you're concerned about them seeing other employees' salary information, do you have any suggestions with regard to how to get around that?
You can't get around it. I mean, unless you have only one person getting all the information, and that person is the only person that sees other people's salaries. Having said that, we all know that for the most part, all of us in the nonprofit field are underpaid. And if someone sees someone else at the same level getting more money, you know, speak up. So really, you know, either one person is charged with knowing this information and you keep the budget private from everybody else, or you just realize that some people are going to see that they're not paid fairly and they might speak up, and maybe they should. So I seem to have a strong opinion about that.
Thank you.
All right, I want to move on. So let's just see. I mean, Kate, can you see if people have people see mistakes?
Yep. Debbie picked up on a couple things. So the first one being in the budget, they are asking to pay for 2 employees at 100%, and the finance associate calculation is incorrect.
Okay. I don't know exactly what there's, okay, great. There are lots of calculations that are mistakes. So good. So let's start. I just broke a bunch of them down. So let's start here. They did include 10% of this total, but they forgot to add it in. Do you see that? 156,000 is their total direct cost. Then they added in 15,000, but they didn't do their Excel spreadsheet right. They forgot to do the addition. Sloppy. That's one mistake. How about this fact? You have $99,000 in personnel. How did they end up with a total budget of 62,000? Oops, they forgot to add all these other things in. Something happened in Excel. Or they just didn't use their brain and look. How about this? Maybe this is what the other person was mentioning. 3% of 43,000 is not 1,093, it's 1,311. So there's mistakes all around here. This is the one I just pointed out, that 99,000 in personnel, you can't have a total project cost that's less than that. And then when I did the math, and actually this is a budget that I was once given. I changed these names just to, I hope you had fun with that. To review, if you add 99,000, 24, all these things in red, it actually equals 140,000. not 156 plus your indirect cost. So it's just got mistakes every which way, every which way. They just didn't check the math. And the reason I showed this big red arrow in here is sometimes you just even look at it, and if you just pull back, you realize, oh, wait a second, that can't be right. We can't have a total project budget that's less than our personnel. And I do encourage you to use Excel formulas, but every now and then, if you delete a line or this or that, you might mess up your formula. So however you choose to check it, you've got to check to make sure everything is correct. So this was one with lots of Excel mistakes. And even if we just pulled back and used a little bit of eyesight, we should have seen some of those errors and known to go back in. All right, that was one. Here is the Westchester County Youth Bureau form that should be coming out any day now for the investing kids. Yes, hopefully.
Yep, we hope to issue an RFP shortly, so everyone stay tuned.
All right, so I wanted to be sure to put this in. So this is largely based on the example that was in their last application. You enter your period, everything here. This is just a different way of doing it, but the same notion, who the position is, we list the positions, what the rate of pay is, the basis, and here I put the key for you. So H is hourly, W is weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly. That's what the county wants you to do. So you have to figure out this rate of pay relates to whatever you are using here. And then your total cost for year 1, 2, and 3, because this is a multi-year budget. And then hopefully your Excel spreadsheet will work and this will be added correctly. All right, then you can write in what you want here, type of service. So I've written in grant writer, the rate, and the cleaning service and the rate, and come up with some numbers that just, again, Excel should do all this addition for you. And here's the third category, maintenance. So you've added this number, which you calculate on attachment E. So you put it in attachment E and it should appear here. And then the Excel, whoopsie, Excel should do these calculations. All right, so attachment E, you can write in other things. So here we've written in for our youth career training program supplies, refreshments, blah, blah, blah. I wrote in travel to a national conference in St. Louis, airfare, room and board. Notice this added up to $7,400 total maintenance. Whoops, I can't seem to go back. But this wasn't carried over properly. Oops, now, wait, sorry, this line. It's possible in your form that it actually might appear correctly. I just wanted to show you that sometimes when you're doing forms, you don't remember to carry over the right number. All right, but let's break down other problems with this budget. I told you should always read the instructions. The instructions with the Youth Bureau budget say any out-of-state travel is not reimbursable without authorization. So unlikely you're going to be putting this in the budget, or you should not do it without authorization. And what was the other thing? Grant writers is not an allowable expense. They give you a list of allowable expenses. So I purposely put in things that were not allowed. So my point here is read the instructions closely and then make sure you've put things in the right places and that things add up correctly. All right, next example. Oh, Kate was kind enough to give me a list of things that were common budget errors with the Invest in Kids budget. So, lack of communication between the administrative staff that writes the budget and the program staff that probably writes the narrative. That very first slide, I said, make sure you're telling the same story. So whoever's doing the budget must understand how and when the program operates and what the activities and staff are that are used to create that. That's that synergy, that making sense. Because too often a budget person might write a budget, a program person might write the narrative, and they just don't make sense. They don't tell the same story. Another point that was raised is lack of transparency with allocations. So there's numbers that just don't make sense or aren't explained. That's the transparency piece, not explained. And including non-reimbursable items on the budget, which is why I made sure in the example I put things that are not allowed. And you have to read the pieces of paper they give you and see what's allowable and what's not. And then always, always, always just read it again one more time. Make sure you're in line and in compliance before submitting. All right. Some of you might have written a Westchester Community Foundation grant. This is their form. They have 4 columns. They give you this list. They give you these categories. The first is what you're going to ask them to pay for. Well, down here, what they're going to pay for, but I can't even read this because my screen is showing, but other funds to be raised for this project, sorry. Funds already committed to the project and total revenues. So down here is where you're asking them to use their money. So take a look. What mistakes do you see?
If anyone notices an error, please feel free to enter it into the chat, or you can even unmute and go ahead and talk.
This is Debbie. In the bottom part where it says the WCF funds that they're trying to use, they said program manager 20%, but we don't know 20% of what. We don't see their total income, so we don't know what that 20% is. I mean, we could calculate it, but that leaves the funders in quick questions.
That's a good point. And actually, this is one way you can get away with flubbing if you don't want to reveal people's salaries to other people. You could just put in 20% of their time. Yes, you could figure it out, but this is one way to obscure it. And given the level of this money, I don't think WCF would mind that you didn't put in 20% times whatever. Yes, it would be better, but this is one way to back off from revealing people's salaries directly. But good point. Thank you, Debbie. Rick.
Line 6 isn't carried over to total revenue.
Yep. Good. Glad you saw that. See here, the 8,000 is not carried over. All right. In fact, let's here. Thank you. So the 8,000 didn't get carried over. Meanwhile, how about the fact that they're asking, they have 43,000 in revenues and the project expense is less. If you're asking for a grant, you don't want to show you have a surplus. Here they have a $3,293 surplus. So that's of concern if it doesn't look like you really need their money. This mistake is subtle and I didn't expect you to get it quickly, but they say administrative costs are allowable here, right in the form, up to 15%. In fact, they calculated it at 20%. That's not okay. And what else do we have here? So those are just a couple of the mistakes on this form. The Westchester Community Program Officer I talked to said, if you can't present a budget that makes sense, it undermines the confidence the program officer has in the organization. So when she gets a budget that's full of errors, you automatically go down in her estimation, and she might be less inclined to favorably present you. Okay? So things like this are just sloppy. You need to double check and make sure you move things over where they should, that you've followed instructions. I got another example, and I think, how are we doing on time? Because I want to have time for questions. What do we have left, Kate?
10 minutes left.
All right, so going through, here's just an example. This is from Mother Cabrini Healthcare Foundation. Budget form instructions. Again, read them. We don't have to read them now, but you must read the instructions carefully and do what they say. Here again, they give you indirect cost instructions. All right, let's do one last one. Any idea what kind of budget this is?
After school program budget?
Maybe. Maybe. Anything else strike you a little odd about this?
Lots of supplies.
Yeah, look at the supplies, $150,000 of supplies. That's a heck of a lot of supplies. All right. In the interest of time and time for questions, so here, I find this really confusing. I was again, actually shown this budget. What am I looking at? Is this a general operating budget? Is it a program? Where are the revenues? What kind of budget is this? I say it's a confusing budget. It raises more questions than answers. And programs, why is transportation under program? That's an administrative expense. Like the categories don't make sense. Why does administration include payroll, total payroll processing, consultants, and website? And if this is a general operating budget, where's all the other operating costs? I'm glad Greg noted that 150,000 supplies just really jumps out. So the last thing I want to do, I want to show you how to build a budget, how I would build a budget. I would not start with revenue. I back into that. I see what my expenses are going to be. I've talked to my program staff. I've talked to the finance to see what we have to include salary-wise. So I'm going to start with personnel. What does it take to run this program? I've learned it's going to take one youth director, and that's how much that salary is. And we're going to include our agency's fringe rate is 20%. And I have a subtotal of personnel. Nice and simple. Other than personnel, I'm told we're going to have a social work intern, and it's a stipend position over the course of the program. That's what we pay the social work intern. We're going to have 2 art specialists or art specialists at 10 hours. We're going to have enrichment specialists. There's the rate. We need supplies, and I've given what they are because that's relatively small amounts. I didn't break it down more. It's possible in your budget narrative, you could say we need whatever, 10 mats at $50. I don't know. refreshments, because we're going to have a culminating event. We've talked about that culminating performance in our narrative, and we're going to get some refreshments donated, but we need to buy some things as well. So that's my subtotal other than personnel. I'm going to add my personnel. Oh, no, sorry. I'm going to add my, maybe I might have made a mistake here. 84,000 plus 97,000. And I should take my administrative overhead on that combined. I'm not positive I did, guys. Sorry. Hopefully I did. Get my administrative overhead, and then I get my total expenses. Then I go back to income. I know that I'm going to ask this funder because I've done my research. I know that the right amount to ask of this funder is 15,000. So I'm going to back in my income to leave me $15,000 short. So my income, I have other grants that I've received or are pending from foundations. I'm putting in my budget. I'm going to get $45,000 from foundations beyond this request. I'm going to allocate from our overall operating budget $40,000 individual giving. I'm going to charge every kid that comes to this program $10 because I want everybody to have skin in the game so they'll show up. This is the last thing I do because you're going to have funny numbers to make your budget balance. So here with my expenses, I come out with $722. I'm going to make that balance in my fundraising allocated from special events to get that $222.
Oh, shoot. No. Probably. Call Barry.
All right.
Oh, God, you're still on hold.
Then I get
Just
my
saying.
total income. Whoever's there,
Yeah.
could you mute yourself? Thank you. That's how I get my total income. And I like to put my total expenses, my total income. I like to say deficit / request. And that's the $15,000 that I'm asking for in my grant narrative. So that's how I back into creating a budget like this. All right. And that's pretty much it. There's my request. It matches my narrative. I think this is the last thing. Here's another form if anybody has ever done an Arts Westchester grant or a Peckham Family Foundation grant. This is the form they use. And I will just tell you, it's annoying because you have to take your full operating budget and break it down into their categories. It's annoying and it's time consuming. And there's no other, well, they break down a lot of revenue. They're very interested in revenues. There's more revenue categories than expense categories, which is unusual. And I think that's about it. I'm going to finish this last slide and then we'll take questions. Do think about the budget early. Bring in the right people so you know everything you need to include in your budget early and it's written in your narrative. Lots of times when I do grants, the numbers change. We decide we want to shift what we're asking for. Just make sure you make the narrative and the budget still the same story, even when you pull something out. Remember, the budget reflects the professionalism of the organization. Convey competency. Don't wait until the last minute to the budget. Start planning it when you start planning the program. Read the instructions carefully. And then my last bit of advice is consider taking a class on using Excel. Those formulas are so helpful. There's lots of places you can take a quick, short, easy class on Excel. So that's that, and let's have questions.
Allison, we have a couple questions in the chat. How do you determine how much to ask for from a funder?
Okay. So that's a whole nother, really webinar is figuring out what's a good funder and what's a good amount. A whole nother workshop, but one generally looks at the 990. One looks to see who they fund, how much this funder gives, do they give in your area, what other organizations are they like you, and you get a sense of how much it makes sense to ask that funder for, and you rate the likelihood of success. So that's, I mean, I could do a whole webinar just on finding the right fit. That's really what that is. But you need to look at the 990 and see what amounts they give so that you know you're in the right range for that funder. Do they give to organizations with your budget size and things like that?
Thank you. That concludes the questions in the chat. If anyone else has another question, if you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead and ask.
And let's see. Oops, I spelled something wrong. That's a resource for you. I just want to, again, encourage people. Greg, you've come to some grant professionals of Lower Hudson workshops. We're really here for you. We do webinars on various topics like how to find the right fit. We had a meeting yesterday planning the fall, and I think we're going to do a workshop in September, how to read a financial statement and an audit. Because when you submit a grant and a budget, there's some red flags that come up in your financial statements and audits that you should be explaining as well as your budget. That's why I'm bringing that up today.
Thank you, Allison. We have one last question, and it actually pertains to that last budget slide.
Okay.
There was a $15,000 request, and the question is, could that $15,000 request be for one expense or multiple expenses? What are your suggestions?
Okay, so this is a single column budget. Let's see. I'm trying to go back. You might be asked, I'm looking for the Westchester community here. You might be asked, how will our money be spent? And it's often in a multiple column budget. So you might have where you might delineate the 15,000 in a budget with columns like this. So this is where the 15,000, you'd show where it was going to go, and here's where other funding is and a total. So you could break it down like that, or you could break it down in the budget narrative and say the 15,000 we request from you will be spent on blank, blank, blank. You could further break down that 15,000 in a budget narrative, but you would have read very carefully what the funder likes to fund. So, for instance, Arts Westchester wants to fund artists. So you'd put artists for them. You would know what the funder did and did not like to fund. Doing a little bit of back research ahead of time. So you could do columns like this. You can make your own, or you can give that more detail in a budget narrative, or it's just part of the request that you could just write in the narrative. Our request to you, the $15,000 is for salary because we know you understand the value of, a critical personnel or something like that. So you can, that's telling the same story in the narrative and the budget.
Great, thank you, Allison. Okay, well, we have no other questions, so that concludes our presentation. I just want to say thank you, Allison, for sharing all of this information with us. for sharing your time, and to everyone for joining us this morning. We appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a great day.
I'm just going to show again my email, and I would appreciate getting any feedback, or if you have any questions, blah, blah, blah. Where am I? Feel free to be in touch with me. I welcome the feedback. When I do these, I don't really see anybody, so any feedback is welcome and appreciated. And hopefully I'll see you at Grant Professionals Workshop in the fall or the spring.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.